here it is. And historians are always second guessing themselves about their interpretation of history. Good historians are. Bad historians just basically take what they've been taught and then never update that or never question that. And I think, just for an example, for myself as a historian, as somebody who's been teaching for quite a long time now, I have increasingly thought of World War I and World War II as the same event with a pause. So that's one way that my perspective on the 20th century has changed as the 21st century has gotten longer. This particular lesson on the Cold War has also changed in the sense that events since I started teaching this course, specifically the Gulf War in 2004, and as well as and also 9/11, all of these sort of occurred after I'd learned the Cold War as a high school student, college student, graduate student. Those happened after the Cold War and pretty much revised a lot of what I thought and taught about the Cold War. I think if before 9/11, if you were taught about the Cold War, you would have been taught, and before 9/11 is 2001. So before 9/11 is, the Cold War is said to have ended in 1991, which is when the Soviet Union collapses. We're not going to talk about the entire Cold War today, because that's really talking about we're going to talk about really the second half of the Cold War, probably in the conservative revolution section. So we're really only going to talk about the beginning of the Cold War up until basically 1963 today, just like we're going to talk about the Civil Rights Movement up until 1963 in the next session. So because 1963 is a really pivotal year, as is 1968, which we'll talk about also later. But the Cold War, I've revised the way that I've taught the Cold War, mainly because the events of 9/11, and as well, not only the invasion of Afghanistan, but the invasion of Iraq in 2004, and then, of course, all of the other US involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan since then, because, by the way, the United States is still in Afghanistan, and that is 19 years later. All of those events made me reconsider the Cold War and look at it. And so there's a whole section in here about the Middle East. Again, just sort of looking forward, we will also be talking in a future session, specifically the last lecture, much more about the Middle East and the United States in relation to foreign policy. So that's a whole other, so the Cold War never really ends for the rest of this course. We talk about it for the rest of this course, but we have to understand where it begins, right? I mean, you have to understand where the Cold War begins, how historians bound the Cold War date-wise. They think about it basically from starting in 1945 to 1991. That's basically the years of the Cold War, mainly because the Soviet Union is said to have dissolved in 1991. And that means the Cold War is over, because the Cold War is between the United States and the Soviet Union. That all sounds nice and wrapped up in a bow. Again, I'm pretty sure that if you fast forward 40 years in the future, historians will have reconsidered even this term, the Cold War. And so that's the traditional way that it's taught. So always, what I'm trying to get at is, you should always reconsider what historians tell you. Even what I tell you, always think that it's wrong. Always in the future, reconsider it and say, how is there a different way of looking at this? Because I'm pretty sure that, especially with United States relations with Russia today, that the history of the United States' relationships with Russia / the Soviet Union will be considered as more of a piece with the recent sort of controversies regarding Russia, both with the Trump administration and both with the rise of Vladimir Putin since 2000. Because all of those are huge issues. Again, we're going to talk a lot about that in the last session. So we never really get out of this Cold War US-Russia context. It's an important context. As well, I don't talk that much in this course about, and it's about the Russian Revolution, which I urge you to look back on. And just to begin with, as a little bit of a, just as a little bit of a refresher from what you probably read in the text, is that Russia itself, just to start with, because we have to start with Russia when we talk about the Cold War, Russia itself was, up until basically the beginning of the 20th century, a very agrarian, largely non-industrialized country. The United States, as we've learned, in the 19th century, industrializes to the extent that by the time of the Civil War, the northern United States is one of the most powerful industrial countries in the world. It's not a country that's going overseas, but it is a country that is industrially powerful. There's railroads, there's factories, right? Russia doesn't really have that. Russia, up until really the 20th century, has a very large agrarian population and does not have many of those factories. It does not have many of those industries, does not have railroads, does not have a lot of that internal development that one would expect out of a developing country. The story of what happens to Russia in its transition to becoming the Soviet Union is the story of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And in 1917, in the middle of World War I, Russia, which was fighting on the side of France and Great Britain, abruptly in 1917 pulls out of the war as a revolution takes place inside Russia. Tsarist Russia, which had been ruled by a series of czars for hundreds of years, collapses as a government is formed first by what you might refer to today as socialists, under the rule of, they're called Mensheviks in 1917 Russia. So in March, there's a revolution which which overthrows the czar. And then in October of 1917, there's what we call a more radical revolution by a group called the Bolsheviks, which takes over Russia. And over the course of a few years, during a sort of massive and bloody civil war in Russia, finally by the early 1920s becomes what we know as the Soviet Union. So that's roughly the story. Of course, the Soviet Union is the first self-avowedly communist country on the face of the earth. It's a country which takes the teachings of Karl Marx and then sort of puts them through the interpretation of Vladimir Lenin and creates a quite radical revolutionary government that seeks to transform the way that governments are made through the ideas of Karl Marx, through the ideas of almost sort of a radical form of equality, sort of all industry is owned by the people as opposed to individuals and sort of large corporations. And that this happens in Russia is unusual because Russia is even during the Russian Revolution, is largely an agrarian country that has just really started to industrialize. So even Karl Marx in the 1840s, when he's talking about what he believes is the march of history towards communism, believes that communism will take place in industrialized countries. He believes it'll take place in Germany or France or the United States, because those countries are industrializing. And in Karl Marx's view, countries that industrialize are the first ones that are going to go towards communism because the workers are going to revolt. The irony of Karl Marx's prediction about communism and the prediction of what countries would turn to communism is that the two largest countries on earth today that are communist, and the two major countries that really turn to communism first, are Russia and China, which are, when they turn to communism, are largely agrarian countries, not industrialized, and definitely not what Karl Marx had in mind. So this is one of the kind of massive ironies of the last 200 years in terms of political thought, that Karl Marx predicts that this will happen in industrialized countries when in fact it happens in countries that are on the way to industrializing, and then sort of in a revolution turn to communism. And then after that, as they're saying that they're turning to communism, they actually install a one-party state in which democratic norms really don't really exist. They basically say that they are going to be democratic countries. You'll find this in the name of many communist countries. They call themselves democratic countries, but when they actually form, they don't form as democracies. They form really as what is often referred to as dictatorships, but really they refer to as one-party states, where they're one-party states where you have to be a member of the party in order to have any power in the country whatsoever. So if you're a member of another party, if you oppose the party in power, well, you might get put in a camp, you might get executed, you might get blacklisted. So that is kind of one of the ironies of what happens, is that Karl Marx is envisioning this kind of democratic people's revolution that takes place in industrialized countries. And then what happens? It happens in industrializing countries, specifically China and Russia. And then what occurs is something profoundly anti-democratic. So there are many people that blame what happens in the Soviet Union and all the deaths that happened in the Soviet Union under Stalin. There were tens of millions of people die under Stalin. Blame that on communism. But I don't know that Karl Marx would have called what actually is the system in China or Russia and the Soviet Union communism. So there's a lot of debates about this politically, whether this political philosophy is actually what you can call communism. So it's a little bit further afield than what we're going to go into today. But when we talk about the Cold War, you have to understand the formation of the Soviet Union and the rise of communism and the fear that communism engendered in the United States. And that fear was really because the United States was and is a largely capitalist country in which private ownership is often tied to a belief in what the United States is supposed to be about. I mean, at least in the minds of many. And so this aspect of private ownership often mitigates against communist ideas or socialist ideas. Well, as we saw in the 1930s, when FDR is being accused of being a communist or being accused of being a socialist because of his advocacy of the New Deal, there is a growing chorus of opposition to any sort of social welfare programs that will help either the indigent, and there begins to be a philosophy of sort of anti-communism, anti-socialism, which takes hold in the United States and is a really powerful force, and is still a really powerful force today. So that said, when we talk about the Cold War is really the galvanizing moment when these anti-communist ideals get tied to how many people feel what the nature of the United States itself is. And so that's an important overall sort of intellectual, sort of psychological view of the Cold War. We always have to keep that in mind about the Cold War, because remember, the Cold War is not really a war. The Cold War is not a war that we think of traditionally. It's not World War II. It's not a war in which you have two sides with massive amounts of arms that are going at it against each other. The Cold War is very different. So let's start talking about the Cold War. Here's a picture, of course, of the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War begins with the destruction of Hiroshima and the destruction of Nagasaki in August of 1945. Now, again, I'm a historian. You should question what I say. Many people say, no, the Cold War begins before that. And we'll see there are events before that that are leading up to it, that are kind of the beginnings of the Cold War in the middle of World War II. But nuclear weapons are vital to understand in the Cold War, because a lot of what makes the Cold War cold, a lot of what prevents, in many ways, the United States and the Soviet Union from going into active war against each other is this picture. This picture in which the effects of the dropping of one bomb that's basically the size of a large desk, right? That one bomb, one piece of technology can cause this amount of destruction and literally burn an entire city to the ground, is what makes the Cold War so much different from any other form of competition that existed before in human history. Now, a lot of what happens in the Cold War is very similar to a lot of things that happened before in human history in terms of competition between powers. But the existence of nuclear weapons is a special difference that separates the time after 1945 from the time before, and especially in relation to the international relations. So let's look at some theories of the Cold War, and this is really simplistic. It's really simplistic in the sense that historians often, if you wanted to split historians into basically three different really loose camps, you'd say there are a lot of Cold War historians that say that it's basically communism and the expansionist belief that's inherent specifically in Soviet communism. Because remember, when Lenin comes to power in 1917 and when the Soviet Union is formed, one of the missions, one of the avowed missions of the Soviet Union is to be sort of a light to the rest of the countries in the world to bring them into communism. So communism is at its very heart somewhat of an expansionist belief. And one of the things that's kind of built into communism is that communism really can't survive in just one country. Communism must internationalize. That's why you have, it's often called the Communist International, or the song that's often sung, one of the main songs is the Internationale. That all countries must turn to communism because the systems of communism and capitalism actually really don't work together. It's really difficult for them to coexist because they compete with each other and they don't work along the same lines. So you really have to turn all of one or the other. And that's one of the main sort of economic. But anyway, in Soviet communism, many historians blame that kind of feature of communism and that feature also of Russian imperialism, which had existed for centuries before under Tsarist Russia, that the ideas of communism and Russian imperialism linked up, they're really to blame for what happens in the Cold War, for the most part. Well, then there are other historians, and most historians are a mix of these two, but then there are other historians that you might say actually blame more of US economic imperialism. Now, of course, that includes many Soviet historians, includes many historians that believe that the United States after 1945 is just as imperialist as the Soviet Union, even though the US routinely denies that it's imperial power, because of course, remember, the United States came from a colonial context. So those sort of, beliefs in the special nature of the United States as being sort of a light to the world to sort of free other peoples, that kind of mitigates against imperialism. But that said, a lot of historians around the world and a lot of countries around the world that have actually experienced American imperialism don't hold the United States blameless during the Cold War. And they say that US economic imperialism is actually to blame, that the United States is trying to actively prevent other countries from turning to not only communism, but really any form of socialism or any form of social welfare. And that includes, to a certain extent, you'll see that phenomenon inside the United States too, that during the Cold War, you're going to see that any sort of hint of a social welfare program, whether that's part of some sort of socialist plan, or whether that's just part of the practicality of getting needed resources into the hands of those who have been routinely discriminated against or don't have, or are impoverished, that's often accused of being communist. So you see this on the domestic front, but you also see this in other countries, that the United States will interfere in the affairs of other countries, specifically to prevent them from adopting any sort of socialist policies and or turning to the Soviet Union for aid and or inspiration and or assistance. So the United States is being imperialist as well. And so we'll see how this occurs as well in various contexts, especially also in the Middle East, which is going to be a feature of what we're going to talk about today. The most common viewpoint, of course, is kind of a compromise. It's that it's really neither of those powers' fault for the Cold War. It's actually, we're dealing with a much older problem, that we're dealing with a balance of power. That the two major powers on Earth, whatever their ideologies are, which some historians regard as rather irrelevant, really we're talking about geopolitics. That you have two massive empires, the Soviet Union and the United States, that are seeking to expand because they're empires. Because this is what empires do. Go all the way back to 10,000 BC and the rise of agriculture in Mesopotamia. Empires compete against each other. And that really what's going on during the Cold War is a balance of power. that's being fought out about and is being cloaked in these kind of ideological ideas. But really, this is a fight between Russia and the United States. And I say Russia because many historians would say, well, yeah, it's the Soviet Union, and yeah, they say they're communist, but it's really just the Russian Empire. So a lot of these are kind of fascinating ways of looking at what's going on. So remember I said at the beginning, the Cold War began in August 1945 with the destruction of Hiroshima. Wait, I lied. Because most historians say that, and we talked about this in the previous lesson, that the Cold War really starts during these two conferences which occur in 1945 between the victors, between specifically the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. Here you have the Yalta Conference, where you have Winston Churchill, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. And they, as a review, remember, they agree to the United Nations. They divide Germany into these 4 military zones of occupation. And remember, all of this is before Hitler has committed suicide and before the actual end of the war, but they're already planning it. Another thing they agree on is that in Poland, which had already really been taken over by Stalin and the Red Army, in Poland will hold free elections. They all agree to that. They all agree to the guarantee of free elections in Poland. This is a big deal for Churchill and Roosevelt, who are really concerned at this point that Stalin, because he's Stalin, because the Soviet Union and all that the Soviet Union is expansionist, and also that the Soviet Union is going to take advantage of things, just like any sort of geopolitical actor would. They don't think that Stalin's going to leave Poland, and they don't think that Stalin's going to hold free elections. So they kind of hold him to it and say, hey, you got to hold free elections. They also develop these secret plans for the Soviet Union to attack Japan. So to attack Japan in the north, the United States will attack in the south, and then they'll both sort of divvy up Japan into these different zones. They all, and as a sort of corollary to this, as a sort of a mirror of this, in Korea, which we remember was occupied by Japan before World War II, Japan will be split into 2 zones. One, which is today North Korea, and the other, which is today South Korea. And those 2 occupation zones are roughly the same as they were today. Pay attention to that, because the Korean War in 1950 to 1953, is going to be the first large-scale global conflict after World War II that many people think is going to lead to World War III. Well, that's that February conference. So remember Yalta. You have to know about Yalta. Yalta is extremely important. But a lot changes between February and July in 1945. First of all, the Germans surrender. Hitler dies. FDR dies. So between February and July, which is really the time of our current pandemic, if you want to think about the time frame, give you a sort of comparable time frame when all this happens, that's what's happened. You have a lot of changes in the composition of the leadership of the victors. You have the disappearance of Germany as a threat and the beginning of the enactment of a lot of these plans in Yalta of dividing Germany into these 4 zones, et cetera. The beginning of thinking about the United Nations. But you still have Japan as a problem. You still have Japan, that the United States is really the major battler against Japan in the Pacific. Russia had really been, Soviet Union had really been concerned with Europe. Great Britain had been pretty much concerned with Europe. And United States is really the only player in the Pacific War. Well, there's another conference in Potsdam in July and August 1945. This is a really important conference too. So you got to remember Yalta and you got to remember Potsdam. So in Potsdam, it's Truman and it's not FDR. And in Potsdam, Truman's coming in with the knowledge that there's just been a successful test in the Trinity test in the New Mexico desert. He has a nuclear weapon. And you can kind of imagine, and commentators at the time commented on this, the kind of swagger that Truman had going into this conference. He's now an individual who feels supremely confident that he's not really going to have to negotiate with Stalin about Japan, because he's going to go ahead, and really the wheels are already in motion to drop these bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the point that he's at this conference at the end of July. He basically is thinking, look, I have this secret weapon. And in fact, his people, in fact, the diplomats go to Stalin's people and say, we have a really big weapon. We have a game changer. And the story at the time is that basically the Soviets kind of shrug them off, that they're kind of like, oh, okay, that's interesting. We'll see what happens. So they don't tell them that much about it, but they tell them they have the bomb. The Soviets had, to a certain extent, been working on one, but the Soviets have been heavily preoccupied with getting the German army out of their country. So there hadn't been that much, there hadn't been very far development on the bomb, and neither with the Germans either. So the United States is pretty confident that they're the only power on earth that has anything close to this. So in Potsdam, they agreed to these policies for the occupation and administration of Germany. So in more sort of clerical paperwork, mopping up as to what to do about Germany now that they're occupying it. They agree to things like disarmament, denazification, democratization, reparation payments, all of those things that they're trying to hash out as to how to make Europe peaceful again and how to prevent war again. But one of the most important things to come out of Potsdam is this Truman attitude, this attitude that he's got the bomb, that this bomb is, they also agree to, as you see here, the unconditional surrender of Japan. But Truman's now thinking, you know what, I don't need Stalin for this, because once the bomb's dropped, we're going to make Japan surrender, and then the United States is going to be the only actor in Japan. And this would be really, really important for the rest of the Cold War, because Japan, for the entire Cold War, is not only a US ally, but for a number of years after World War II, essentially occupied by the United States. In fact, Douglas MacArthur becomes essentially the head of Japan for a couple of years. Well, so you start to see the elements of this competition, where Stalin is in Poland. He's agreed to free elections, but nobody thinks he's going to do it. In Japan, they've asked for Soviet help, but then Truman says, hey, I have a bomb. And then Truman goes ahead and drops it and then sort of takes over Japan. So you have the beginning of this kind of suspicion between the two powers that's sort of building up. And when we talk about the nomenclature, meaning the naming of the war, why is it so cold? Well, the easy explanation is it's not a hot war. And a hot war, the term hot war means that's a war that's going on. That's a war in which both sides are fiercely fighting for advantage with military technology, with bombs, with guns, with tanks, etc. That's a hot war. World War II is a hot war. And that's between two sides. So if the Cold War is, the two sides in the Cold War are the US and the Soviet Union, they never fight against each other directly. They always fight through surrogates. They always fight through other countries. So the Cold War involves a number of different wars, which are hot within it, but never have US and Soviet troops facing off against each other. Some of those wars in the Cold War are the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Afghanistan War of 1980, a number of different wars in Africa, a number of different conflicts in the Middle East, wars in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America, okay? So there's a number of different wars that are going on, which are part of the larger Cold War. But ironically, the two sides in the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union, never fight against each other directly. It's also an ideological war in which, and this is another way that it's cold, in that it's not seen, or at least this is not the major message that comes out of each side. Each side is not saying, oh, I'm fighting against the United States. And the United States is not saying, I'm fighting against the Soviet Union. Each of them say, the United States says, we're fighting against the specter of global communism. And the Soviet Union says, we're fighting against, we're fighting against the march of, rapacious capitalism. So they're really not, the message coming out is that this isn't a war between two countries. This is a war between two ways of life and two visions for the future of humanity. Some people say, well, that's just an excuse, but you know, that's one of the reasons why it's called cold. You have these spheres of influence as opposed to the actors actually going to war with each other. It's also cold in that it's a war that when the two sides do kill each other and do go to war against each other, it's in secret. So spies die in the Cold War. A lot of the Cold War is one of suspicion and distrust and sort of subterfuge. If you are a fan of James Bond movies, James Bond is a Cold War creation. The idea of espionage, that each of these sides has espionage services. CIA is the United States espionage service, the KGB is going to be the Soviet Union's espionage service, and MI6 is going to be the British espionage service. And each other country also has their own espionage service, Mossad in Israel, for instance. And each country has a group of spies, which on all countries always had spies before, but much more so than before, that a lot rides on what spies do. And a lot rides on how much intelligence each side can get from the other, both in terms of technological information as to the strength of warheads and the distance that warheads can travel and the strength of nuclear weapons and all sorts of technologies like that, radar, et cetera. And a lot rides on stealing that information from each other. And really, some of the only deaths between the two sides occur when one side kills another spy, but you never hear about that. And then, of course, the suspicion, distrust, and fear are compounded by nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in general. This is not just nuclear weapons. We're also talking about chemical weapons, biological weapons. All of these sort of are there as threats in this war, and that these weapons of mass destruction, the thought that they can be used at any one time and cause massive civilian death, is something which causes a pervasive climate of fear, not only in the halls of, in Washington, D.C. and in Moscow, but in every single home in the United States and every single home in the Soviet Union. So this is a pervasive fear. This is not something that you can sort of think that this war is occurring somewhere else and sort of put it out of mind. And then, of course, we have McCarthyism. This fear, and this was fear in the Soviet Union, was that you'd be taken away in the middle of the night and sent to the Gulag and sent into a prison camp, right? In the United States, there's a growing pervasive kind of fear that you would be accused of being a communist and therefore be blacklisted and lose your job and lose your livelihood and not be able to. So there's a sort of, there are systems in place which are causing fear and suspicion in the populace, in both populaces as well. Another reason why it's cold is that both sides fear a chain reaction, that the killing of one spy can, through a series of miscommunications, lead to all-out nuclear war. That the death of one Soviet, Red Army or Soviet troop, or the death of one American troop at the hands of each other, could escalate into full-blown nuclear war and result in the death of millions. So it's cold. It's Cold War, and that's cold if you think about it in that sense. So let's look at Europe going into the Cold War and check out this map because it's a really important map. And the map is largely accurate all the way to 1991. You have these sides in green, which is the NATO members. And we'll talk about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And then here you have these Warsaw Pact members who are part of the sort of Soviet Union sphere. Notice, most importantly, the position of Germany. Here's what sort of Nazi Germany, or Germany under Hitler, consisted of, at least the sort of central area of it. Notice Austria has now been potted off and is neutral in this scenario. But Germany has been split between West Germany and in East Germany. This is really not until 1955. This is development which takes a few years to occur. But nevertheless, by 1955, 10 years after World War II, you have East Germany, you have West Germany. Notice where Berlin, the capital, the Nazi capital was, is all the way in East Germany. Notice how Berlin is itself split into these four zones, okay? And see, 1947, America, Britain, and France merged their zones of occupation as West Berlin. So just like what happens in West Germany happens as a mirror in East Germany, except Berlin is in East Germany. And there, here, oh, look at, here's the Berlin Wall, 1961. So that's really the progression of how this happens. 1945, end of the war. 1947, you see that the Allies sort of merge their areas into larger sort of governable examples of West Berlin and West Germany. Then by 1955, you have sort of these two sides, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, facing off. And then by 1961, you see the Soviets and the East Germans. The East German government builds this wall between the two Berlins. There's no wall here, by the way, that'd be too long of a wall. But the wall here is the Berlin Wall. So remember, Truman's in power. He's got the bomb. He drops it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States takes over Japan. And the two sides, basically between 1945 and 1947, Soviet Union and the United States, are kind of looking at each other quite warily. The Soviet Union, of course, does not allow free elections in Poland. They occupy Poland. This drags on. They keep saying they're going to do it, and they don't do it. So by 1947, the United States is pretty convinced that that Stalin and the Soviets are not going to leave, go back here, are not going to leave any of these countries that they invaded when they were pushing back the Germans. So basically all of these countries now have leaders by 1947 who are largely puppets of the Soviet Union. So they all have leaders who have to answer the Soviet Union. If they try to rebel against the Soviet Union, they're usually deposed or sort of whisked away in the middle of the night. In 1947, though, a lot of this starts to begin in Greece. Oh, sorry, let's go back to the map again. Here's Greece. Notice Greece down here. Well, Greece is a really important geographic space on the European continent, especially if you are a country like the Soviet Union that does not have that has traditionally, Russia has traditionally had this problem. Russia has traditionally had this problem of not having access to a warm water naval port. Areas up here could be frozen in the winter. Russia has long had access to the Black Sea, although that depends on what the status of Ukraine is. This will become a flashpoint in recent years, the Crimean Peninsula. There was a Crimean War in the 1850s, which was fought over this peninsula as well. So this is really strategic. So this is really Russia's only way of getting ships into the Mediterranean and then into the ocean. They can do it here, but again, you can't do it all year round. So Russia's always wanted this kind of warm water access. But look at this warm water access. You got to go through here, through Constantinople. You can, if non-friendly power controls this, they can't go through. So Russia really wants a warm water port. Hello, Greece. So if they can get control of Greece, if they can turn Greece into a communist country that has the Soviet Union as an ally, the Soviet Union will have this power to radiate their naval power into the Mediterranean. This is something the Soviet Union really, really wants. It's something Russia has always really, really wanted. And by the way, it's something Russia wants today. Okay. Russia really wants that today. It's just one of the geopolitical considerations of the nature of Russia. Remember, though, of course, with global warming, which Russia doesn't seem too concerned about, those ports that are usually frozen over in the north now are largely ice-free during the winter. So it's less of a concern. Nevertheless, who knows how long that will continue. Anyway, so Greece in 1947 starts to undergo unrest. The British, who had a lot of influence in Greece and had a lot of influence in Greece post-World War II, are really unable to support the democratically elected sort of Western-leaning government there. And it seems like there's a communist takeover imminent of Greece. It looks like the communists are going to take over and they're going to turn to the Soviet Union. Well, Truman sort of makes this famous speech. And this speech in 1947, which he gives, really cements what the United States is going to do in relation to the Soviet Union for the rest of the Cold War. He says that, Truman says, we must support Greece in their march to democracy. We must prevent communists from taking over. And he advocates the sending of, a large amount of US aid and support into Greece. This succeeds in stabilizing the situation in Greece and succeeds in preventing the Soviet Union from having from having Greece as an ally in the Mediterranean. But it's really the beginning of the Cold War, because now it's really the United States and the Soviet Union really fighting through surrogates inside Greece over the composition of the Greek government. So Greece will be pretty important in the beginning of the Cold War, because this is really not the first shots, but it's the first time that both sides really become actively involved in jostling for the government of a particular country. And what starts to develop, and two terms that you should know coming out of the Cold War, one of which becomes a important term very soon after, and very like during basically Truman's speech and during the formation of his doctrine, and one which becomes more important actually during the 1960s and the Vietnam War era. The first term is going to be containment, which is a term that's really going to be coined by George Kennan right here, who's the author of The Long Telegram. We'll talk about that in a second. The idea behind containment basically is that, and Kennan talks about this a lot more, but the idea behind containment is that as long as the United States seeks to contain the Soviet Union from turning any other countries to communism and turning them into allies, the United States can sort of box in the Soviet Union, which, because of its sort of expansionist ideology and because it's an empire, if you contain that empire, at a certain point, it will stop growing and stop being dynamic, and people will stop believing in it. So containment, the kind of idea is you got to contain it. Any movement of communism anywhere in the world is seen as a threat to the United States. That's the philosophy. Whether or not that comports with reality or not, that's the philosophy that occupies many American military planners, many American politicians, et cetera. So it's the idea of containment. The domino theory, which is an idea which is largely associated with Southeast Asia and late 1950s and 1960s anti-communist Cold War American thought, is that you allow one country to go. If you allow containment to burst and you allow one country to go, other countries will go in rapid succession. And if you apply this to Southeast Asia, if you let Vietnam become communist, then Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand will become communist. And then Indonesia will become communist. And then Malaysia will become communist. And then you see, so the idea is you got to stop it. You got to stop the dam from bursting when it's just a trickle. So those are two really important terms. In 1948, as another kind of chapter in the Cold War, you have a coup in Czechoslovakia, which at this point is really a Soviet satellite state. And in this coup, the Soviet Union is able to really overthrow the government of Czechoslovakia, which is starting to lean to the West. So in 1948, that really cements the inclusion of Czechoslovakia in this bloc. And here's Czechoslovakia right here. And today, Czechoslovakia, by the way, in case you're confused, consists of two countries, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. Czechoslovakia was the country that was really created after World War I, after the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was defeated in World War I. So Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary. So all of this was part of one empire. And so Czechoslovakia today is two countries, the Czech, and it's really kind of split kind of right about there. So you have the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. But Czechoslovakia as a country really exists basically from 1917, the end of World War I, all the way to the 1990s. The United States, remember, the United States, a lot of their power is economic. The United States is an economic powerhouse. The Soviet Union cannot compete with the US economy. And it's one of the major reasons why the Soviet Union ends up collapsing in the 1990s. It's not only because of a lot of structural problems in the communist system, but also because the United States is more powerful and more advanced industrially by the end of World War II. And one of the major legacies of what occurs post-World War II that the United States initiates, which sort of cements perhaps its victory in the Cold War long-term, is the Marshall Plan. This is a plan which is enacted by Congress, and the plan basically says that the United States will lend billions upon billions of dollars to any country in really Europe any country in Europe that was affected by World War II to try to rebuild those countries. It's cloaked as, it's sort of sold as a economic rejuvenation plan for many of these countries. And in many cases, that's what it is. Because of the Marshall Plan, countries like France and Germany and Great Britain and any country in Western Europe is able to come back from the war quite quickly. Now, one catch, though, in the Marshall Plan, and this is the big catch, is that the United States is lending money that must be used to purchase American construction company goods, or those sort of companies that are allied with American corporations. So you can't use that money to kind of give that to the Soviet Union to help them rebuild your country. No, 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 no. This has to be money that's spent basically in sort of approved areas, largely United States owned or managed or associated. So the Marshall Plan really helps Western Europe, but all of the countries of Eastern Europe, which are under the sway of the Soviet Union by this point, they all reject the assistance. Soviet Union's even offered the assistance, and they kind of scoff at it. They go, "No way, this is a trap." Well, I talked about the long telegram, so let's look at the long telegram. And this is a telegram that this diplomat named George Kennan, who's a longtime Russian diplomat. He's a longtime diplomat working in Russia for the United States, and he sends back to Washington this very learned and very kind of considered psychological portrait of Russia. And what the long telegram does, it becomes hugely influential because it's sent as a telegram. But the idea is it kind of gets passed around and becomes really part of US thought in relation to the Cold War. And Kennan, one of his major thesis is that don't look at the USSR as this communist country. You really should look at it as Russia. You really should look at it as, you have to understand the psychology of the Russian people and the Russian government. So Kennan says, first of all, the USSR thinks it's in this perpetual war against capitalism. That's part of their ideology set. That's kind of what they think. So that's part of their thought process as to how they approach the United States. They're in a long war. They're in a long perpetual war that they believe they're going to have to fight for a long time. Kennan also says that it's more of a danger. It's left-wing non-communist groups in other countries are a worse enemy than capitalist ones, and that you shouldn't pay too much attention to these sort of communist cells, which are not going to have that much power in these other countries. You should pay attention to left-leaning groups that might take assistance or advice or inspiration from the Soviet Union, because they're going to be the ones that you need to watch out for, especially in the European context, because those are the ones that the Soviet Union is going to target and try to influence. He also says that anybody that is a Marxist in another country, at least this is how the Soviet Union sees it, they're allies with the Soviet Union, and they should try to be controlled. I mean, they should try to be controlled in one way or the other, either by blackmail or by sort of just using them as spies, or using them just as sort of ideological or propaganda arms inside those countries. And then we get to these older ideas of Kennan, that Soviet aggression is really rooted in what he calls a kind of neurosis of Russian nationalism. That Russia's imperial designs are constant because of the geopolitical needs of Russia, such as the warm water port and sort of the threat from Germany and, you know, expansion into Asia. And that Soviet aggression is really rooted in these older ideas of Russian nationalism, and that most people in Russia don't really care about this. It's really kind of the power center in Moscow that cares about this. So this is an interesting kind of insight into the Russian people. And that the Soviet government structure, the way that the Soviet Union had structured itself, which was vaguely similar to how the Tsarist government had structured itself, had kind of insulated itself against opposition, right? So any sort of other idea that comes into their sphere, especially with Stalin, who's basically killed anybody who comes up with ideas that disagree with him, that the Soviet government structure actually inhibits any sort of objective rationale. That the Soviet government kind of operates on a series of fantasies, which may or may not work, but basically because there is no free and open thought, it's a huge vulnerability of the Soviet government, and that the United States should try to exploit it. So this gives you an idea of how Kennan and this very influential telegram come to influence the way that U.S. intelligence operatives and military planners see the Soviet Union. In any case, remember Berlin. So let's start talking about Berlin again. We go to Berlin. The Nazi capital is now ground zero for the Cold War. In 1948, the Soviets start to blockade West Berlin. They basically say to the Western powers, look, get your armaments and get your people out of West Berlin. This is inside the Eastern Zone. This is part of our zone. We control Berlin. Well, Britain and the United States respond to this because, remember, containment. No amount of land can be given to communism. The United States cannot capitulate to this based on containment doctrine. So what they do is, even though this is just half of one city, which is inside the Soviet zone in East Germany, they engage in what's called the Berlin Airlift. And in the Berlin Airlift, British and US planes drop millions of tons of supplies into West Berlin after the Soviets have sort of ringed that half of the city and blockaded it. The Berlin Airlift is hugely inspirational for those who are sort of getting into the drama of the Soviet Union versus the United States, and the United States is helping prop up the free world and prop up the rights of those in West Berlin. And the Berlin Airlift becomes a kind of galvanizing point in the Cold War in which the two sides become really firmly defined. That now you have, the land of the free, or the free world, against the Soviet Union and what Winston Churchill calls the Iron Curtain of communism, which is coming down across Europe. He calls it the Iron Curtain, and the Iron Curtain comes to define that line where Soviet influence begins and ends. And in 1949, Great Britain and the United States and a number of other countries come together to form NATO. Now, NATO is still with us today. President Donald Trump, in his 2016 campaign, railed against NATO over and over again. Trump and the Trump administration have routinely tried to undermine NATO for reasons that are not always completely clear, largely because NATO is the force which not only prevents the expansion of Soviet communism and the expansion of the Soviet Union largely through the last half of the 20th century, but NATO is a hugely important sort of coalition of countries. Because what these countries have all agreed to, and agreed to in 1949 when they signed this document, they all agreed to collective security. And in collective security, what that means is, if any one of those countries is attacked by any other country outside of those countries, so if the Soviet Union decides to, say, take over Iceland, every other country must come in on Iceland's behalf. This is known as collective security. And if you want an interesting demonstration of collective security, there has only been one time in the history of NATO that NATO has had to be called upon to defend one of the actors in those countries that are in NATO. And that was on 9/11, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because NATO outlives the Soviet Union. NATO is still around. And with the attack on the United States, that article in the NATO Charter is activated, which activates the defense of the United States and brings all of those countries in to support the American invasion of Afghanistan. That gives you an interesting perspective as to when this NATO article is actually used, because those countries are actually never attacked by the Soviet Union during the time that the NATO Charter is enforced, during the time of the Soviet Union. So here you have, again, Germany after the Second World War. These three zones become East Germany. Here's West Germany, and then here's Berlin, here's West Berlin, here's East Berlin, and here's the Berlin Wall and the blockade. We're not up to the wall yet. Wall doesn't get built until over a decade after this airlift. Well, the airlift succeeds. The Soviets stop blockading. The Soviets kind of agree, okay, you can have this long, lonely road, which goes all the way from West Germany into West Berlin, but that's it. And if you were to drive from West Germany to West Berlin during the Cold War, you would have to go through this long highway, which has absolutely no stops, and to get you from one point to the other. Well, in 1949, the world is shocked because between 1945 and 1949, there is only one power on Earth that has atomic weapons, and that's the United States. The United States does not use those atomic weapons except in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in 1949, the Soviets detonate their first atomic bomb. The plans for this atomic bomb largely came through Manhattan Project espionage and through espionage inside the United States and in Europe, in which plans for the original atomic bomb are kind of funneled gradually to the Soviet Union. It would be hard to see how these plans could be kept completely secret for too long, but nevertheless, by 1949, the Soviets have developed an atomic bomb and they detonate it. And now you have two nuclear-powered countries. One thing we have to remember is that both of these atomic bombs by 1949 are similar bombs to those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, meaning they are still relatively small. Yeah, they can destroy a city, and yeah, people are scared about them, but the yield of these bombs is not that high. There is the specter. There is the specter in the future of much more powerful bombs, but they have not been developed yet. In 1955, West Germany is admitted to NATO. So now West Germany is part of NATO, and so an attack by the Soviet Union or by East Germany on West Germany would require basically turn into World War III. And you have puppet governments that form in the Eastern Bloc: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, which goes through a 1956 revolt, but that is crushed. Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and East Germany. So all of these nations now are part of what is called the Warsaw Pact, which is really an answer to NATO. So NATO forms first. Here's NATO, and then here's the Warsaw Pact. So, and now those are your two main actors in the Cold War, although really at the head of the NATO is the United States and the head of the Warsaw Pact is the Soviet Union. So, okay. And during the Cold War, the story is that these are not puppet states because these are part of NATO and they're independent democracies, which is largely true, that these are actually puppet states because they are sort of presided over under a totalitarian sort of dictatorship in the Soviet Union. So largely that is true. Anyway, in the United States, one of the main problems which starts to develop is that the fear of communist influence in the United States starts to grow. During the 1930s and the 1940s, there was a committee in Congress, and this committee actually lasted all the way into the 1970s, called the House Un-American Activities Committee, or known as HUAC, H-U-A-C. And the House Un-American Activities Committee, it's one of its most well-advertised activities was trying to uncover communist influence in Hollywood. Because the belief was that the kind of films that were coming out of Hollywood during World War II and afterwards had all of these socialist kind of messages in them, and that in any case, and that the Hollywood was a kind of a hotbed of socialism. Well, Humphrey Bogart, for instance, was taken before the House Un-American Activities Committee and kind of humiliated there. Charlie Chaplin, who had a sort of resort in Ireland, which I actually visited once, who had this giant house in Ireland. He was actually refused re-entry to the United States based on his vague association with communists in Hollywood, supposed communists. And you had a kind of developing in this committee this idea that what had to be done was that these people would be called up through the committee and then they would be questioned. They say, did you associate with this person? Did you associate with this person? And then either someone would name names, meaning sort of tell who they had associated with, or they would be blacklisted, or then the other people would be blacklisted who they named. And this is in the 1960s and 70s and elsewhere, this sort of McCarthyism or this kind of sort of naming names idea has been likened to the Salem witch trials. That basically there's this tendrils of accusation about communism that sort of expand out, and then people start to name names of people that are vaguely associated with people who are vaguely socialist, and then many of these people lose their careers as a result of this. Some of the reasons for communist paranoia, which are going on in the United States, is that the United States is a country which has as a First Amendment the freedom of speech. You could say whatever you want. So when people start to say things that seem vaguely pro-communist or vaguely pro-socialist, that is often sort of held up as an example of why communists are taking over the country. So you hear a lot of communist talk because people can say whatever they want in the United States. Another reason for communist paranoia is a pretty large strain of what's known as anti-intellectualism in American life, that a sort of rejection of studied analytical views on a subject, and that communism is an easy way to kind of divide people into two camps. Are you with the communists or are you against the communists, right? Can you have a view that is more complex about the world than to put you in a box that says, are you for capitalism or communism? In 1951, in one of the most infamous events during the Cold War, the husband and wife couple of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are both sent to the electric chair for passing nuclear secrets through third parties to the Soviet Union. The reason why this becomes controversial is because they're two of the only people that are executed for capital crimes for this. Their involvement with it does not seem to many people to be as strong as those that actually gave the plans. In any case, they're also Jewish. So often the Rosenberg trial is held up as an example of kind of the union between anti-communism and anti-Semitism, which was kind of not totally below the surface during the 1940s and 1950s, largely because just like the Soviet Union, well, just like Hitler, for instance, associated communism with Jews for the most part. The idea that it was, Hollywood, so Hollywood types, quote unquote, who were Jewish, who were communists. So you see this kind of trail of kind of accusations and insinuations, which often sort of occurred very thinly below the surface of anti-communist paranoia during the 1950s. So some of the effects on progressivism, remember the progressive movement is sort of all of those ideas of, hey, the role of the government is to improve the lots of those who have less opportunity. Well, progressivism suffers as a result of anti-communism because anything that seems vaguely socialist in any way whatsoever is accused of being socialist and is largely defeated in Congress. One of the reasons why the United States is one of the only countries, I think the only advanced industrial country in the world that does not have some sort of robust form of universal health care, is largely because whenever the idea for universal health care came up, the accusations of this is a communist plot, this is a communist plot against doctors, this is a communist plot against the health system, and is often sort of cloaked in these terms of that's socialist, that's communism, that's socialism, that's communism. Do you want to be like the Soviet Union? And so any sort of attempt to create some sort of social welfare system on behalf of, for health, which would be a cheaper alternative, but I won't get into that, is seen as socialist or communist. And so, and there's a lot of other social welfare programs that come up that are accused of being that are struck down and or not as robust as they perhaps could or should be, largely because they're accused of being communist in the Cold War context. And a lot of these accusations and sort of these sort of stereotyping of some of these ideas, which analytically might be good ideas, are accused of sort of moving the United States away from private industry and towards communism. Anyway, McCarthy, who sort of takes up the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1950, comes forth and says, I have the names of people in the US State Department who are communists. And then he basically goes on what's called a witch hunt, where he starts calling up people in the State Department, saying, you have to name names in the State Department. Remember, McCarthy's a Republican. In 1950, the Truman administration is Truman's a Democrat. And so McCarthy is basically calling up all of these individuals, and he's a senator from Wisconsin, and getting them to try to name names. So now this is kind of a form of what happened in Hollywood, but now it's in the government. I say Roy Cohn because this is Roy Cohn right here. And why Roy Cohn's important, because as a sort of chain of kind of history, Roy Cohn was really McCarthy's right-hand man during the McCarthy hearings. He was kind of McCarthy's bulldog. He was sort of sent to do things. He was kind of the, sort of real sort of figure behind the scenes of McCarthy's brain. Well, McCarthy falls. I mean, McCarthy is actually disgraced. He starts to go after the U.S. Army, starts to call up members of the Army up and accusing them of being communists. And then basically even his fellow Republicans basically pull the plug on his hearings. They say, look, man, you're way out there. And McCarthy dies not too soon after. He was a terrible alcoholic. But Roy Cohn, his career goes on. Roy Cohn becomes a really fascinating figure. He is in the 1970s and 80s, and Donald Trump will admit to this, he really becomes kind of the inspiration for Donald Trump and his look on life. Roy Cohn is somebody who is still a bulldog, still goes after people very tenaciously, does not really have a very highly developed kind of publicly in relation to his own head of the Justice Department, who used to be Jeff Sessions, basically says, where's my Roy Cohn? Where's my guy who will do anything and be fiercely loyal to me and not question anything? And so Roy Cohn's kind of become a symbol of fiercely loyal, largely amoral figure. And Roy Cohn's just a fascinating figure. There'll be giant biographies written about him for probably the next century. So if you want to look him up, he's a fascinating figure. In any case, that's the McCarthy era, which comes to a close largely with the election of Dwight Eisenhower to the presidency in 1952, the first Republican president. And we'll talk about Eisenhower in a second. But during Truman's administration, the Korean War breaks out. And to talk about the Korean War, we're going to go back to Asia, and we're going to have to understand this series of events which result in sort of the collapse of Korea into this really terrible war. I mean, we often forget about the Korean War today, largely because it's sandwiched in between the World War II and the Vietnam War. It's often called the Forgotten War in the United States. Korean War veterans are often bitter about the fact that their war that they fought in, which was, again, a terrible war, is forgotten about. So let's talk about the Korean War. It is a fascinating war. I mean, much like the Spanish-American War, it's a war which has a lot of clues. It perhaps tells us more about the United States and about the situation in the world than large wars that the United States engages in. In 1949, and this begins with China. You can't separate out the Korean War from China, because China borders North Korea, borders Korea, the Korean Peninsula. China has a huge amount of influence on the Korean Peninsula and has for time immemorial. Remember, during World War II, Korea was occupied by Japan, okay? And then Korea is split into two parts after the war is over. Well, in 1949, a long simmering, basically a 2-decade civil war inside China is finally sort of resolved when the communists under Mao Zedong take over and force Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, also known as the Kuomintang, force the Chiang Kai-shek out of mainland China. What occurs is all the nationalists basically flee and take hold of Taiwan, which for basically from 1949 to the 1970s is the only recognized entity, the only entity the United States recognizes as China will be the island of Taiwan. Remember, Taiwan was formerly occupied by Japan too. But now Taiwan, which by the way, Taiwan has its own history. Taiwan often wants to be completely independent of China itself. Taiwan has its own identity itself. And so Taiwan today remains independent, although China does not recognize Taiwan as independent. And when we talk about flashpoints for World War III, Taiwan always comes up. So pay attention to Taiwan, because if China ever decides to try to take over Taiwan, who knows what will happen. And what happens in the United States is that once China becomes communist, now you have this second major global country, with a huge landmass turning into communist. And now pretty much all of Asia, I mean, all of mainland Asia, basically from China all the way to Eastern Russia and then into Europe, is now controlled by communists. Well, this engenders a lot more paranoia inside the United States. And this is a lot of the reasons why the McCarthy hearings take off. Because this whole kind of anti-communist paranoia starts after China and Red China, which is what anti-communists in the United States call China. So this paranoia about it takes off. Well, so China now is this, this sort of forming country in, basically they're coalescing as this communist-run country and putting themselves together back together after years of civil war. Well, now remember, Korea had been divided along something called the 38th parallel, which was a sort of line of latitude. And so north of that line, roughly, was North Korea. South of that line, and North Korea was allied with the Soviet Union. And south of that line is allied to the United States, is South Korea. Well, let's show you on this map what happens. This is probably the best way to illustrate this. Here's China, right, which has newly become communist in 1949 under the People's Republic of China. Here's North Korea, which has obviously a lot of alliances with this new communist China, because originally this was a parallel that was basically Soviet influence, US influence. So now it's becoming a little bit more complicated. Also remember, just because China and the Soviet Union are both communist does not mean they like each other. In fact, China and the Soviet Union will engage in several low-key wars or low-key conflicts during the course of their existence. And China and the Soviet Union are not friends. So that's something to keep in mind. They're both powers that are competing against each other, even though they're both supposedly communist and for international communism. Well, look what happens here in the course of the war. In 1950, in really somewhat of a surprise, North Korean forces, here you have them in red, swoop down into South Korea and take over most of this peninsula, right? This is seen as an act of war. It's seen as a huge provocation. And remember, there's now a United Nations. So Truman, instead of saying, okay, the United States is going to go in and sort of defend South Korea, they go to the United Nations and they basically start what is called a police action. It's not a war. This is a police action. This is the rest of the world coming in to the United Nations, agreeing that this was an act of aggression and agreeing that this act of aggression must be pushed back. And so they send in largely a US force, but there's a smattering of other countries that have devout troops. Well, General Douglas MacArthur, who had been ruler of Japan after World War II, remember his role in the Bonus Army in 1932. Then he's, fights basically as commander of forces in the Pacific and then becomes ruler of Japan. Well, Douglas MacArthur is put in charge of the forces to basically reinvade the Korean Peninsula. Well, after North Korean forces move all the way down through this peninsula, MacArthur comes in and the US lands in September 1950 here at Incheon, which is right near where Seoul is, this huge city. And the US is able to push these North Korean forces, because the US has a very powerful army, push them back further and further and further, all the way to the Chinese border. As the US starts to get close to the Chinese border, notice this at Chosin. The US gets within miles of the Chinese border and China erupts. China sends thousands of troops across the Chinese border, and now it looks like you're going to have World War III. Now it looks like China, it's going to be a war between China and the United States. McCarthy turns to basically Truman and says, give me the power to use tactical nukes inside China. We will end communism on the Korean Peninsula, and we will end communism in China. This is the sort of idea. Well, the Chinese are really having none of this idea. They send in forces, push back the US forces to this kind of this line where the US has advanced to. MacArthur basically starts to talk to politicians in the United States. Now remember, the election's coming up. Some politicians are saying, hey, MacArthur, you got to run for president. Right? You got to run for president. You're great. And MacArthur starts having whispers about saying, what if I just keep going? What if I go into China? What if I really engage China? And he starts to float this idea to some politicians. Truman gets wind of this and fires him. So in the middle of the Korean War, this individual who was like largely seen as an American hero, perhaps seen as a candidate for president in 1952, who has been basically emperor of Japan, had been the head of Japan, basically been the Eisenhower of the Pacific, just the most famous military leader in the United States, is relieved of his command and comes home. And that's really the end of MacArthur's career. And what Truman does is Truman says, no, what we said to do was a police action on behalf of the United Nations. We are going to put this armistice line back here. We are only fighting to reestablish the 38th parallel, basically. Okay, that's all they're doing. Well, this is something which Eisenhower will actually, ironically, Eisenhower, who gets elected in 1952, and now Truman has not run again, Eisenhower wins the presidency quite handily in 1952, is inaugurated in 1953, and really runs on a platform of ending the Korean War. So you have this military leader who comes in as kind of like a peacenik in a sense. And basically they ended with an armistice in 1953. This armistice line, remember, an armistice is not a peace agreement. North Korea and South Korea are still officially at war. This is just a frozen line of war. It's basically the war goes through, basically it's de-escalated. You have here in Seoul today, millions of Koreans who live in Seoul. It's a huge city. Seoul is just across the border of North Korea. The reason why this is such a dangerous place on the planet is that North Korea has a series of mountains here with massive amounts of conventional weapons, which at a moment's notice, like within 15 minutes basically, they can bomb Seoul, and just with conventional weapons alone, the estimates are that they can kill up to 100,000 people in a week. So any sort of provocation across this line, which by the way is not, there's no peace here. These two countries are at war. Still, since 1953, believe it or not, that the reason why this is such a dangerous, dangerous place in the world is that Kim Jong-un and the leadership in North Korea, this is a really, real definition of a totalitarian dictatorship. North Korea is, the prison camps in North Korea are absolutely terrible. It's just a place with no real freedom, individual freedoms. It's really a Stalinist style country in a way. It's kind of a survival of the Cold War in a sense. In any case, this is frozen. And so this is really one of the big reasons why there's no re-invasion of North Korea, why nobody rational ever really considers it, because of the massive loss of life which would occur within days. And nobody really knows how to solve this, quite frankly, except to depose the leadership of North Korea. In any case, Eisenhower gets elected, and he's the first Republican president since Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover leaves office 1932, 1933. Eisenhower enters 1953. So you got 20 years of FDR and Truman. Well, this is a different Republican Party. This is not a Hoover Republican Party. Eisenhower does not give one care in the world about the New Deal, about dismantling it, or anything like that. That's not his concern. He's not an ideological Republican in the vein of Hoover at all. We're going to see the reemergence of that idea set in Republicans in the 1960s. So pay attention to that when we get to the conservative revolution section, especially in the election of 1964. Eisenhower's vice president, by the way, is going to be Richard Nixon. So everybody knows Richard Nixon. So Eisenhower ends the Korean War in 1953. And the way that Eisenhower engages in foreign policy is that under his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who has given his name to Dulles Airport now, by the way, they basically, which is in Washington, D.C., they expand the CIA, they expand the espionage services, and they expand what's known as covert intervention. Now, what Eisenhower is concerned with is not really engaging in a military sense, such as what was done in the Korean War. He's much more concerned with destabilizing those countries which might be turning towards the Soviet Union, and also building up a massive nuclear arsenal. The thought process being that if the US builds up its nuclear arsenal to a massive extent, that that the Soviet Union will never really challenge them. And a lot of this is occasioned by the invention in 1952 of the first hydrogen bomb, or the H-bomb. The H-bomb operates on a different concept than the earlier bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are fission bombs. These are largely fusion bombs. Hydrogen bombs, the difference is largely what's going on in a fusion bomb is what's going on in the sun. So I'm not going to explain all of it. It takes a little bit too long, and also I'd probably get a couple things wrong. But the hydrogen bomb is massively more powerful. And the US tests actually the hydrogen bomb in the Pacific on a series of atolls in the Marshall Islands. Atolls being sort of like these sandy kind of sandbar islands in the Marshall Islands. These islands are inhabited. And the H-bomb, one of the first H-bombs is dropped on an atoll called Bikini. The invention of the bikini, the swimsuit, comes from a French designer who thought that bikinis were what people would look like if they came out of a nuclear war, that's what they would be wearing. So that's, if you want a little bit of history about the bikini, it comes from the idea of the bikini from these sort of South Pacific H-bomb tests in the 1950s. And so the H-bomb is used first on these islands as sort of as these tests, and then becomes the main weapon in the US arsenal. This is the new bomb. This is a bomb which far eclipses anything that the Soviet Union has. Remember one thing though, between the invention of the atomic bomb in 1945 and then the invention of the H-bomb in 1952, and all the way to the launch of Sputnik in 1957, the United States, in order to deliver these nuclear warheads, not warheads, deliver these nuclear bombs, must fly a plane over the place where it wants to drop the bomb. These bombs must be dropped from a relatively close location. You do have missiles, right? Missiles have been developed, but these missiles largely have to be sort of short-range missiles. They have to be missiles that travel through the atmosphere. Missiles that travel through the atmosphere have a lot of drag, take a lot of time, and can be notoriously unreliable. In 1957, the Soviet Union really does a one-up on the United States and launches Sputnik. I'll get back to the rest of that slide in a second. Here we have Wernher von Braun, former SS officer, who basically ran a concentration camp in Europe during World War II. He was a Nazi SS officer. He was also a fierce kind of idealist in terms of rockets. Since a child, he wanted to create rockets to get to the moon, get into outer space. He'd always had these ideas. He then started to work for the Nazi regime during the 1930s, who gave him a lot of money to develop rockets, largely to bomb London. He developed the V1 and the V2 rocket, both of which were used to indiscriminately fire into London and kill civilians. And then Wernher von Braun, after 1945, after the collapse of Germany, is basically kidnapped or sort of whisked away by American Secret Service, basically American espionage services, under an operation called Operation Paperclip. And he's basically whisked away and brought to the United States and sent to the desert, deserts of Texas and New Mexico, et cetera, where they start to say, listen, we want you to develop these rockets for us. You have this technology, we want this technology. And in fact, what the Soviet Union and the United States do is they both basically steal former Nazi rocketeers and use them to create their own space programs. So when we think about the US space program in the 1960s, it really owes its existence to these Nazi rocketeers in the 1930s who are building them to create the first rockets to sort of launch at other countries as a sort of really as a form of terrorism, because these are not rockets which have any sort of guidance system. They're not rockets which have any sort of use in terms of, these are rockets which are fired from Peenemünde, a sort of a peninsula on the North Sea during the World War II, and just land in London and blow up buildings and kill women and children. So these are not rockets which are used in any sort of strategic sense. Sputnik then becomes the first man-made satellite. So in 1957, the Soviets developed rocket technology to such an extent that they're able to put on the tip of a rocket a satellite. Basically, it just beeps. It's called Sputnik. And they put this on the tip of a satellite and launch this into space. And it becomes the first man-made object outside the Earth's atmosphere. Previous to Sputnik, everything outside of the Earth's atmosphere was created by the universe and rocks and time. Now you have a piece of metal crafted by humans, which is put into the atmosphere. The immediate effect of Sputnik is quite crazed in the United States. Lyndon Johnson, who at the time was in Congress in 1957, recalled that being out on his ranch in Texas, he could go up and you could find out about this. You could look up and you could see the first satellite. Today, you can see all sorts of satellites. If you go out after sunset to a dark place, you can see all sorts of satellites going through the heavens. But Johnson goes out and he sees Sputnik and he gets this chill. Because he realizes that if you have Sputnik, that the Soviet Union, which has all of these nuclear weapons, can drop one anywhere they want. That is, as long as they develop the technology, they can fire something into the atmosphere and fire it around the Earth. And this is the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so until 1957, there is no way for the US or the Soviet Union to launch from their soil nuclear weapons at each other. 1957, that occurs. And what starts to occur, and has occurred really during the entire 1950s, is this belief that with superior air power and bomb power, the United States and the Soviet Union could really affect their will on any countries they wanted. This hubris, meaning this kind of belief or sort of false pride, would be what the United States is going to take into Vietnam. And the United States is going to drop more bombs. The United States, by the way, drops more bombs on North Korea during the Korean War than the United States drops in all of World War II. And that the same thing is going to happen in the Vietnam War. The United States is going to drop more bombs on Vietnam in the Vietnam War than all the bombs dropped in World War II. And the United States is going to lose. So this sort of idea that the United States can exert power across the planet just by having these bombs and this air power, in Vietnam, that kind of fantasy kind of unravels. So we'll talk about that when we get to Vietnam. In 1961, Eisenhower leaves office after John F. Kennedy is elected, and we'll talk about that in a second. And as he leaves office, he gives a speech, which I urge you all to watch. I'm not going to play it right now, but he gives a speech that warns about what we talked about before, and he names it. It's not like I made up the term. He calls it the military-industrial complex. He says the military-industrial complex has an insidious effect on the US government and on US decision-making. that because of the union of the US military and industry, that they exist as a kind of, basically he says, he doesn't say this, but he, in no uncertain terms, it's basically like a shadow government behind the scenes, which is exerting power in all the halls of Congress and even in the executive branch. And he's a president. And he says, the American people need to watch out for this military industrial complex because it can cannibalize the American way of life in terms of the US Constitution, individual protections, protections of individual liberties, that if the military and US industry get too closely allied, they will become, and they are able to convince enough people to vote for those groups that will sponsor, they'll be sponsored by the military industrial complex and take money from the military industrial complex. American freedoms will be eroded and perhaps disappear. And this is a really stark warning, a stark farewell speech by Eisenhower as he's leaving office in 1961. And it's one of the most haunting presidential farewell speeches, because this comes from somebody who really built up this military industrial complex. And this is somebody who's leaving and saying, look, you know, it's become this beast that I can't really even control. Well, remember Sputnik. Here's Sputnik on the launch pad. Well, the US after 1957, during the Cold War, starts to realize, wow, we're really behind in creating these rockets. We are so far behind in creating the technologies necessary to threaten the Soviet Union in the same way. So now the United States, which up until 1952 had always been ahead of the Soviet Union in terms of the creation of weaponry, right? Suddenly in 1957 finds itself seemingly like 100 years in the past in terms of being able to deliver that weaponry. So now the Soviet Union has a real big advantage on the United States. The Soviet Union can theoretically launch a nuclear weapon in 1957 to US soil from the Soviet Union. The United States has no power to do that. Now, the United States has missiles in Turkey. The United States has missiles in Europe. But again, these are short-term tactical, or, you know, these are short-term nuclear weapons. And the Soviet Union now can sort of build up its arsenal all at once and then launch them all at the United States. So this causes a lot of consternation inside the United States and inside political circles and inside military circles. What starts to be talked about is the missile gap, is the fact that the United States doesn't have any missiles. And what the United States starts to do is they start to pour millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars into developing these missiles. And they hope Werner von Braun will help them with this, and and other rocket scientists. Well, in the late 50s and early 60s, the United States forms basically what we call today NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, excuse me. And the idea behind NASA is to create these rockets to start to be able to put satellites up into the air to base, and also to compete against the Soviet Union in the creation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. So NASA, while we consider it today as part of human spaceflight, is really also part of a Cold War design to get more intercontinental ballistic missiles. That is ostensibly part of a different program, but the first missiles, the first Titan missiles, which put Americans into space, are really just retrofitted nuclear missiles. So the United States develops a whole series of nuclear missiles, which can launch satellites into space. So they catch up to the Soviet Union, but then the Soviets put Yuri Gagarin into space. They put the first man into space. They put the first woman into space. Soviet Union puts the first woman into space 2 decades before the United States does. So the United States starts to develop these missiles, but they're always one step behind the Soviet Union. And this becomes a real kind of big horse race in the Cold War. That how do you put up, how do you compete with each other in terms of the length and the size and the speed and the accuracy of your missiles? And then also, as a kind of sidebar to that, although an important sidebar, is the propaganda nature of putting humans into space. Because people are watching humans go into space. They're not, they don't really want to think about nuclear missiles, but it's really the same exact technology. So humans are really being put on the top of nuclear missiles, and there's one way to look at it, during the early 60s and launched into outer space. And if that seems nuts, Well, when you really think about it, it kind of does. I mean, you're putting humans on nuclear missiles. But that's what human spaceflight is. That's what human spaceflight is, and that's largely what human spaceflight still is today, is putting humans on top of hugely powerful liquid-propelled rockets. Well, anyway, the Mercury 7 become the first 7 U.S. astronauts. Many of them make it into space. The U.S. starts to compete against the Soviet Union in space. And then, of course, we'll see once Kennedy gets elected, we'll start to see the development of the moon mission and the Apollo program. But we'll talk about that later. Well, so the space program, part of the Cold War, we're going to talk about that more when we talk about Kennedy. And we're going to talk about that more when we talk about the Vietnam War. This part about the Middle East and the Cold War, we're going to talk about more when we talk about our last lesson. But I want to start with it now, because the Middle East becomes a really important flashpoint in the Cold War, and it's often unrecognized as this. But in the story of the Middle East is extremely complex. And if anybody gets a chance to take a course in the history of the Middle East, going back all the way to, I mean, you go back into ancient history with this, but the rise of, for instance, the history of the rise of Islam in the 7th century and on, it's just an absolutely fascinating story about the rise of this really massive series of empires, which are largely not taught, certainly in any sort of most Western history courses, but it's a fascinating topic. All the time that Europe is in the Dark Ages, you have this sort of vast Islamic empires. But nevertheless, the Middle Eastern history is fascinating, but part of the history of what happens in the Middle East, really, let's start with World War I. In World War I, before World War I, and in the hundreds of years before that, the last sort of massive Islamic empire was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I essentially cracks and falls apart into a whole bunch of different pieces. And it had been very, very weak. It had been called the sick man of Europe. That was the term that was used in relation to the Ottoman Empire, because it was very, very weak and really couldn't hold itself together. And really the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, many people thought threatened war. And in fact, what happens in Sarajevo is partially a result. Sarajevo in 1914, the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, is largely an after effect of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. So in any case, in 1916, Britain and France come together and have this Sykes-Picot Agreement, named after Sykes and Picot, kind of come up with it. And in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, basically because they've now become the major powers in the Middle East after the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, Britain and France start to sort of do their colonial thing, and they take over large sectors of the Middle East to kind of administer it. And in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they sort of make all these lines saying, okay, this is British territory, this is French territory. Those lines are roughly coincidental today with the borders of, say, Jordan and Iraq and Syria. So Syria has, a lot of French influence. Iraq was kind of controlled by the British, had a lot of English. So you see a lot of the sort of map of the Middle East today is drawn really at the end of World War I. And one aspect of that is that these lines are not lines that many of the people in the Middle East would have drawn if they were trying to determine for themselves their own destiny. So you have a number of countries in the Middle East which are largely controlled for most of the 20th century by very kind of authoritarian leaders, because the borders are so porous and indefensible that you have leaders like Saddam Hussein, who really hold together this kind of patchwork of ethnicities and identities inside Iraq, which doesn't necessarily work and would fall apart if there was not some sort of strong dictatorial leader in the center. So anyway, there's a way of looking. We'll talk about this a lot more when we talk about the Middle East. But in 1948, of course, you have the creation of Israel. Israel, which before had been Palestine, which had been a British protectorate. So since World War I, under basically the protection of the British, Palestine had been sort of administered by Britain. In 1917, in the Balfour Declaration, which is a sort of declaration by the sort of a British foreign minister, that basically there should be some sort of homeland for Jews inside what was then Palestine, and sort of advocating for that. Well, Israel is created in 1948, of course, after the horrors of the Holocaust and after the sort of migration of many Jews in Europe to Israel. Palestine starts to get a substantial, and had a substantial all the way since the beginning, and had always had a substantial, but increasingly in the first half of the 20th century is having a larger and larger Jewish population in Israel. And in 1948, Israel becomes its own state. Now, the creation of Israel is immediately met with war by neighboring Arab countries who believe that this is a beachhead for sort of Western imperialism inside of the Middle East. And this creates, in fact, that first war to sort of crush Israel by many of these Arab nations ringing Israel is the start of basically the Palestinian refugee problem, which still exists today in Israel and in Palestine. And so you have this creation of this country, which right at its very moment, which is an inspirational creation of a country, for a people who had no sort of national status before, and in which it suffered through, obviously, the Holocaust. Now you have this small but quite powerful country in the Middle East, which has obviously a lot of allies in Western Europe and the United States. And so you have this beginning of a lot of enmity between these different sides as a result of the creation of Israel. And this becomes a flashpoint in the Cold War. Because remember, Israel is largely allied with the United States for most of the second half of the 20th century, and not really the Soviet Union. So it's a powerful ally for the United States to have in the region. And the United States also is not just concerned with Israel and Palestine, of course. In Iran, for instance, and now we get to, oh, interesting. Like if you want to know about the history of Iran and what happens in Iran and why there's an Iranian revolution in 1979 and why there is I don't know why I keep putting this 53 years, it kind of dates the slide, doesn't it? Why Iran has become today is largely seen as, I guess an adversary of the United States, depending upon, who you talk to, it's kind of one of the major, United States adversaries in the world. How that develops, to understand the history of Iran, you have to understand the post-World War II history of Iran and US relations with Iran. So in 1953, there is a leader named Mohammad Mossadegh, who is elected the leader of Iran and immediately goes to seize British petroleum oil fields, which had been in Iran, for most of the 20th century, and seeks to nationalize those oil fields. Well, Britain doesn't like this at all, right? And Mossadegh is actually overthrown in a CIA, basically a plot. Mossadegh is actually kept under house arrest for many years. He eventually dies inside his house. In any case, Mossadegh is overthrown, and basically a sort of a military leader who's called the Shah is installed as the leader, and really there's like a 25-year dictatorship. So from basically 1953 to 1979, at the time of the sort of student revolution or the Islamic revolution, whatever sort of moniker you want to give to it, that occurs in 1979, which results in the US hostage crisis, in which all these hostages are taken from the US embassy in Tehran. There is a dictatorship in Iran, which is largely supported by the United States. So a lot of the enmity that occurs between the United States and Iran after 1979 has to not only do with the style of Iran's leadership, which is, also not democratically elected going forward, but has a lot to do with this previous history and distrust. So the United States is, and remember, this is part of Eisenhower's sort of designs on covert intervention, that this is what the CIA does in Iran. And CIA is doing this elsewhere too. In 1956, there's a Suez crisis in which Egypt seeks to nationalize the dam in the Suez, and then basically Britain has control of the dam and Nasser turns to the Soviet Union. This turns into a big crisis and the British try to fight it. And Eisenhower says, you know, let's put this under an international protectorate. And it's really the end of British control in the Middle East. That's really the time when Middle East control of the Middle East by Britain kind of disappears. And the US really becomes the major player there. The Eisenhower Doctrine, which is kind of similar to the Truman Doctrine, specifically involves the Middle East, that the United States has the responsibility and will intervene in any sort of military action by the Soviet Union in relation to Jordan or Lebanon to stop international communism. So the Eisenhower Doctrine is really the Truman Doctrine. If the Truman Doctrine applies to Europe and Asia, the Eisenhower Doctrine applies to the Middle East. Here is the Sykes-Picot Agreement, how these different lines kind of result in the current map of the Middle East, and how each of these countries at various times, and largely today, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan all have either monarchs or you know, sort of authoritarian leaders of one way, shape, or form. Also Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. So, and many people, I mean, this is not the universally held term, believe that the Sykes-Picot Agreement at the end of 1916, this sort of hastily cobbled together plan, created the conditions which resulted in largely the instability in the Middle East, which exists to this day. So that's, again, there's different opinions about that. Here is when we talk about the military-industrial complex, just you want to see it on a map. Here's Santa Monica. The history of Los Angeles after the 1950s is, yeah, there's Hollywood, right? And yeah, there's, you know, all the other things you associate with California, all the other industries, but it's really the defense industry and the aerospace industry which become a major employer in Los Angeles and in Southern California beginning in 1955. And I'm sure some of you probably have relatives who have worked in this industry in one way, shape, or form. You have Lockheed, you have Aerojet, you have General Dynamics, you have all of these military bases. And so this becomes a really important aircraft, and specifically military aircraft and military technologies, as well as space technologies, become a major employer in the Los Angeles area. Here we have the NATO map. I'm going to go back to this map later. Well, just as a hint of where we go on to the civil rights era, to understand why civil rights emerges as a major issue after World War II in relation to the Cold War. And now we're moving into the next lessons. So, but we will talk about Kennedy for a second. To understand the civil rights movement, you have to understand the United States after the Cold War has a huge public relations problem. And that public relations problem is if the United States is trying to compete with the Soviet Union for hearts and minds all over the world. And they're trying to compete in many countries in which the Soviet Union is coming in and saying, look, communism is the way of the future. We believe in equal rights for all. We do not discriminate, et cetera. And they come in and they kind of have their message. Well, the United States comes in as a message and says, we're fighting for freedom for all people. We're fighting for individual liberties, et cetera. But then the Soviet Union comes in and says, the United States keeps talking about freedom and democracy. Have you ever seen pictures of the American South? Have you seen pictures of segregation in the American South? And this becomes a really compelling argument in Africa. And Africa becomes a really hotbed for United States and Soviet Union competition during the Cold War. And so the United States is starting to have a public image problem. That their message of being the bastion of light for the free world is really running into the cold reality in the Cold War of the existence of essentially a police state in the American South. And increasingly, American politicians are sort of beginning to realize this. And there are a lot of critiques that start to come out in the 1950s in conjunction with the waging of the Cold War. That some of the same people who waged the Cold War and some of the hardest Cold Warriors start to say, look, what's going on in the American South is just not acceptable. That something has to change. And something has to change fast because we're losing the public relations battle around the world with these images. Another thing which makes civil rights and racial issues and race relations a major issue, or an issue that politicians start to feel comfortable with discussing, is that during the Cold War, you can't talk about class or economics. So you can't talk about poverty as an issue affecting blacks and whites, because then you're talking about economic issues, which then get to socialism and communism, right? Then get to issues which could be construed as any sort of reform that you want to make could be construed as being moving towards socialism and communism. So instead, although it's an uncomfortable issue, the issue of race becomes more palatable of a way of seeking reform in the United States. Because if you talk about class and economic issues, you could get blacklisted, right? You could get sort of a, basically you could be silenced, where people just don't want you to talk about that because of the fear and distrust that come about during communism or during the Cold War. So instead, what starts to come up is civil rights. And the civil rights is a very difficult issue. The issue of American race relations is a huge issue. It's a huge internal issue. But a lot of times it kind of, sometimes, and some scholars have said this, issues of race mitigate against what those common class and economic commonalities blacks and whites have. So poor blacks and poor whites have the same economic concerns, but they often, historically in the United States, those concerns have not been united because of the desires of many American politicians to divide Americans by race. So this is a complex issue, but it's an interesting way of looking at why you don't see these class and economic issues come up during the Cold War, because the Cold War is really an ideological battle over these issues. But you start to have this emerging narrative in the 1950s, even among outside of the South, that something must be done about the South. Well, I know I'm going long, but I do want to finish, and I do want to get into Kennedy, and this is kind of the end of our talk about missiles and Cold War and all of this. So just bear with me for a few more minutes. Election of 1960. Eisenhower leaves office in 1961. He serves until January, blah, blah, blah. John F. Kennedy in the election of 1960 runs against Richard Nixon, who is the vice presidential, obviously the vice president of Eisenhower. So it seems like Nixon has a lot of advantages, right? He's the vice president. He's a fierce Cold warrior. He's got a lot of experience. And so he runs on the Republican Party ticket. Well, unfortunately, he's running against a hugely popular senator named John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy would be the first Catholic elected to the presidency, the only Catholic elected to the presidency. Kennedy comes from a sort of a rather wealthy Massachusetts family. His father was actually kind of a bootlegger, but they're a really powerful and influential family in Massachusetts. They look the part. Kennedy is young. He's become the youngest president ever elected. He's attractive, I guess you might say, generally by the standards of presidents. He's seen as more youthful and vigorous than Nixon. And he kind of develops a kind of a feeling around him that Kennedy is the voice of the youth of the future. And you have a growing youth movement. Remember, and we'll talk about this when we get to the Civil Rights Movement. But the Civil Rights Movement by 1960 is really about at least 6 years old at that point. So Kennedy's coming in and he's sort of harnessing a lot of this youth energy for change inside the United States. Now, Kennedy is no real civil rights activist, right? Remember Kennedy, hey, look at who elects Kennedy. All these Southern Democrats, just like FDR. Kennedy still got this coalition. Oh, but look at that. Oh, but look at that. Harry Byrd takes 15 votes away from this solid. So you see the beginning, and this goes back to 1948, and there's a states' rights party that runs. But you start to find that many of these southern states start to see that the Democratic Party is moving towards a northern-style Democratic Party, which has race as one of its issues. And you find that many of these segregationists start to form their own parties. But Kennedy is still able to carry these states. Hey, look at that. Nixon was Florida. So you start to see the cracking of this Democratic coalition even in 1960. And Kennedy comes in, he's got this young wife who it seems like this, they start to call they start to call what the Kennedy presidency becomes as Camelot, which is a famous movie of the era, basically sort of King Arthur. They sort of see this young sort of new family coming in, unlike, that's very different, at least in terms of religious background, than other American presidential families. And this is greeted with a lot of optimism. There's a huge rush of desire to like Kennedy. Kennedy seems likable, right? His smile, etc. We'll talk about Kennedy extensively later. He's a very enigmatic and fascinating president. Well, JFK actually runs as a Cold warrior against Nixon. So he actually runs to the right of Nixon, as you might say, in terms of weaponry. He says the United States has a missile gap. The United States needs to make more nuclear missiles. JFK is no peace-loving kind of candidate. He basically says, we don't have enough nuclear missiles. We need to make more. When JFK comes into, he also says that he will, sort of continue Eisenhower's ideas of counterinsurgency, basically build up sort of armed forces, US armed forces that will sort of work against communist influence. He creates the Green Berets, which are kind of this elite force, which will train anti-communist forces in various countries. He creates a Peace Corps, which will create a group of civilians, which will go into underdeveloped countries and help, with clean water and help with things that'll make people happy with the United States, kind of like a propaganda arm of the US military in a sense, but not doing military activities. And what starts to dominate foreign policy in the early years of JFK is Cuba. So remember, we talked about Cuba in the rise of US military ascendancy and sort of right at the beginning of the Spanish-American War in 1898. Well, now Cuba comes up as an issue again. In 1959, Cuba is controlled by really a US-backed, just like the US has kind of been interfering in other countries around the world, the US had kind of had influence in Cuba for most of the 20th century. And the leader of Cuba, Batista, was really seen as kind of a notorious kind of autocrat who's really had a lot of one of the major influences on Batista was actually the US mafia. There were a lot of casinos in Havana and in Cuba. And so there were a lot of ties to organized crime that Batista had. So what happens in 1959 is there's a homegrown revolution by a man named Fidel Castro, aided by Che Guevara, who is not Cuban, comes from South America. But these two sort of communist revolutionaries, which begin this kind of force and are able to overthrow Batista on Cuba. And this comes as a real surprise. It's a real kind of a surprise to Eisenhower. This is really, remember, in the end of Eisenhower's sort of presidency in 1959. And they immediately established relations with the Soviet Union. This is a huge problem for the United States. If you thought that anti-communists were freaking out about China and about other actions around the world in the 1950s, or freaking out about Sputnik, well, the creation of a Soviet satellite state 90 miles away from Florida, this is a huge, huge problem for many in the US military. And the US military, under Eisenhower, and supposedly under Nixon, because they're kind of assuming that Nixon will be elected, they create a plan. They create a plan that basically was designed for Nixon to use. And the design was that as soon as Nixon got elected, the United States was going to invade Cuba. And these plans are all drawn up. These plans are drawn up to a T. The U.S. has recruited a number of Cuban Cuban nationals who had fled to the United States after the Fidel Castro's takeover, and to sort of train them in Central America and in Florida, and basically, and so when Kennedy comes into power, the military planners come to Kennedy and say, they put basically the plans on his desk and go, look, we were going to do this basically as soon as Nixon got elected. They might not say it in those words, but we were going to do this, and now this is your plan. All you have to do is say go. And Kennedy's like, what? We're invading Cuba? And so Kennedy at first kind of hesitates, and then he's kind of swayed by the military leaders that perhaps this is something to do. But he doesn't really have his heart in it because it wasn't really his plan, and it really wasn't hatched. Remember, Nixon was a vice president, so Nixon was kind of hatching this plan. So what happens is in 1961, in April of 1961, the United States, a number of these insurgents who are trained by the United States land in what's called the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba. And the idea is that the United States is going to supply air support to help the advance of these troops towards Havana. They're going to march across the island to Havana and unseat Fidel Castro. Well, this is a massive problem. And this is a map of both the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, because they take place in successive years, because a lot's happening in Cuba. So here you have April 17th, 1961. They land these troops in the Bay of Pigs, and Kennedy calls off the air support. Kennedy does not support at the last minute this group of soldiers that are on the beach in Havana about to invade. The US military is absolutely livid at this. First of all, it's a huge black eye for the United States. The United States seems like they're not, they've hatched this plan and they're not going through. Kennedy looks completely inexperienced. The US military is just, again, incensed at Kennedy for not following through with the other elements of this plan. But Kennedy, at the last moment, was basically like, this is ridiculous. This plan is totally half-baked. And so, nevertheless, Kennedy comes out looking really weak. The United States comes out looking really weak. The Soviet Union comes out looking really good. And Fidel Castro comes out looking great. Well, Fidel Castro gets a lot of confidence. In 1961, the Soviet Union builds the Berlin Wall. Increasingly, it looks like JFK is losing control of the Cold War, and it looks like the Soviet Union is taking advantage of this relatively inexperienced president. Okay? 1962, then, we have really probably the most pivotal moment in the Cold War. The most pivotal moment in the Cold War is going to occur during what's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Filled with this kind of confidence after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and at the behest of the Soviet Union, Castro invites the Soviet Union to build missile bases inside Cuba, nuclear missile bases right off the coast of Florida. The United States starts to see, here's the Berlin Wall, here's the victory of the Bay of Pigs, starts to build a number of airfields to launch these nuclear missiles at the United States. The US that year also deployed, because remember the missile gap argument from Kennedy, deploys 5,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles in Turkey and elsewhere. And that really solves the missile gap and also grows the US nuclear arsenal by 5 times. So now the US has missiles, ICBMs inside the United States, as well as missiles in Turkey and elsewhere. Well, the USSR, we could say, is retaliating against this, and sort of strategically, Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, Stalin has died a few years earlier. In fact, if you want to see a funny movie, which is a great history movie, go see The Death of Stalin, just as an aside. It's a fascinating, great movie. In any case, Khrushchev sends these missiles to Cuba, but via boat. These missiles are being shipped over. And Kennedy gets on TV. Kennedy gets on TV and addresses the American people and says, look, and this is in October, says, I have ordered a military blockade of Cuba. I have sent US ships to intercept Soviet vessels. Any vessel approaching Cuba will be intercepted and detained. And he's like, I have to warn you, this could lead to nuclear war. Basically, we're at a really tense point. It looks like the United States is about to intercept a Soviet Union ship, and it looks like any sort of misunderstanding could result in the firing of nuclear weapons, because both sides have kind of kind of staked a lot in this nuclear weapon buildup. A series of events occurs in which Bobby Kennedy, who is John F. Kennedy's brother and his attorney general, is sent to talk to the Soviets and sent to negotiate. And basically what happens is, in the eyes of the American public, Khrushchev backs down because the ships turn around, the bases are dismantled. But in exchange for that, basically what Kennedy gets is, Kennedy says, okay, and this is secret, he takes the missiles out of Turkey, he removes some of the nuclear missiles from Turkey, and he also gives a guarantee that the United States will not try to take out Fidel Castro, will not try to overthrow Castro anymore. So the United States does give something, and today we still have Cuba, which is ostensibly a communist-led country off the Florida coast, which is run by Fidel Castro's brother. So Fidel Castro died just a few years ago, even after ruling the country for almost 50 years. So you have a situation where the situation with Cuba, the history goes all the way, it's a fascinating story. It goes all the way back to the Spanish-American War and US involvement, or all the way back to the Ostend Manifesto in the 1840s, and goes through the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is this pivotal moment in the Cold War. Because after this, the United States and the Soviet Union both install hotlines in the Kremlin and in the White House so that each president can contact each other, each head of the country, could contact each other at a moment's notice. And you start to see a diminution of the tensions in the Cold War after the missile crisis. Because each side realizes that they have come within perhaps minutes of launching a full-scale nuclear war on each side. You could have had the destruction of New York and Washington, D.C. and Miami and major cities in the United States, could have had the destruction of Moscow. This would have rewritten world history. And this was the closest the world came to global nuclear war, was during 1962. And after 1962, you see tensions ease. And it's a long, slow road to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. But at the same time, it is a dissolution and a tamping down of a lot of this tension. Kennedy, through this, with all of the criticism he suffered during the Bay of Pigs fiasco, now has become an American hero. Now, many Americans feel like Kennedy has saved them from nuclear annihilation. And he says, he starts to go to the Soviet Union, look, we have this idea to go into space together. Kennedy says, look, let's go to the moon. He gives a speech at Rice University in Texas. Let's go to the moon before this decade is out. And starts to say to the Soviet Union, starts to make overtures to the Soviet Union that says, look, maybe we should do this together. Maybe we should go to the moon together. And you start to see this possibility in 1963 of a real thawing in relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. At the same time, Kennedy is sending advisors into Vietnam. So at the same time, you see other hotspots around the world developing. But in 1963, going into 1963, this pivotal year in the United States, pivotal year in the civil rights movement, as you'll see on Monday, but this pivotal year in the United States history where for a moment, it seems like the Cold War is solvable and the civil rights problems in the United States are solvable. And they're solvable with this young, dynamic, now very well-liked president at the helm. And that's how 1963 starts to develop. How 1963 will end is very different, as we all know. And we will talk about, I think we all know what happens to John F. Kennedy in 1963. But, well, yeah, in November 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. And for many Americans, it seems like a lot of that hope disappeared with the death of Kennedy. That's symbolic and probably not, it's hard to really quantify that. But 1963 is this pivotal year. And it's a fascinating year to study further. And we'll talk about it more. What we'll talk about on Monday, what you'll see in the session on Monday, I have more of these. I'll just leave you with this image of what is the fulfillment of Kennedy's legacy after 6 years after he's assassinated, is that the United States does put humans on the moon before the Soviet Union. So the United States does beat the Soviet Union to the moon in what by 1969 has become, yes, it's part of the Cold War, but the fact that the United States is actually sort of besting, quote unquote, the Soviet Union is less of a story by 1969 than maybe it might have been, say, in 1963. And I'll just leave you with this at the end.
I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene. That's all right, I don't mind a bit. How is the quality of the TV? Oh, it's beautiful, Mike, it really is. Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent? Yes, indeed. They got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the.
And that's it. And we will talk more about space age going forward to a certain extent. And we'll talk more about Kennedy. And we'll talk extensively about the Kennedy assassination. So don't worry, we're not going to gloss over that. And we'll talk, again, what we will talk about next week is not only the Civil Rights Movement, but also the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, and then the backlash against many of the civil rights movements in the 1970s, as well as the year of 1968, which if you think 1963 is pivotal, just wait till 1968. So anyway, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for today. Sorry I went so long today.